Across the room, Alexander Thorne commanded attention as always. Charismatic, polished, with that effortless charm that made boardrooms bow and headlines swoon. He laughed loudly, arm draped around a tech investor, recounting how his latest AI startup had just been valued at $3 billion. But when his eyes met Elena's across the room, his smile softened. Just for a second. A private signal. "You're my anchor," it seemed to say. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the staff had dimmed the lights, they sat together on the terrace. The city hummed below like a sleeping beast. "You were quiet tonight," Alexander said, swirling amber whiskey in his glass. "Everything okay?" Elena wrapped her arms around herself, though the night wasn't cold. "I got an offer today," she said softly. "From the state attorney's office. A senior counsel position." Alexander paused, then smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's impressive. But Elena, you know how chaotic that world is. With your background, you could be advising Fortune 500s, not chasing petty fraud cases." "It's not petty to me," she replied, voice steady but trembling underneath. "It's purpose." He reached for her hand. "You already have purpose. You have me. And everything I've built, we've built. Why risk that for courtroom drama?" She looked at him then, not at the billionaire, not at the public figure, but at the man she'd married 5 years ago, the one who'd whispered promises under string lights in Napa Valley. "You'll never have to prove your worth to anyone again." Back then, it sounded like love. Now it felt like a cage. "I don't want your protection, Alex," she said, pulling her hand away gently. "I want my voice back." He frowned, confused. "Your voice? You speak at every gala. You sit on boards. What more do you need?" "That's not my voice," she whispered. "That's the echo of yours." A silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. Alexander stood, pacing now, frustration tightening his jaw. "You think I've silenced you? After everything I've given you? The homes, the security, the life? It's not about what you gave me," she said, tears welling but not falling. "It's about what you took without asking, my choices, my time, my belief that I mattered beyond being Alexander Thorne's wife." He stopped pacing, looked at her as if seeing her for the first time in years. And in that moment, something shifted. Not anger. Not yet. But fear. The fear of losing control. "You're being dramatic," he said finally, turning toward the door. "Get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow." But they never did. Because that night, Elena lay awake, staring at the ceiling of a bedroom larger than her childhood home, realizing a truth that settled in her bones like winter frost. Love shouldn't feel like permission. And respect shouldn't come with conditions. She didn't know it then, but this quiet ache in her chest, the one that felt like grief for a future she hadn't even lost yet, would become the seed of everything that followed. The divorce, the fall, the silence, and for years later, the gavel that would echo through a courtroom neither of them expected to share again. But for now, in that penthouse above a sleeping city, all she had was her breath, her truth, and the unbearable weight of loving someone who saw her as part of his empire, not as her own nation. Okay, now act as a narrator and storyteller. Develop the story without marking each topic as you develop it. Tell me about topic 2 with dialogue as if I were the spectator, always remembering to develop it with a lot of emotion, with many feelings, so that the narrative structure uses a linear timeline so that the spectator feels what the character is feeling. In English, with 6,000 characters, the months that followed that autumn night began like a slow unraveling. A thread pulled gently from the hem of a once pristine gown, invisible at first, then impossible to ignore. Elena tried. Oh, how she tried. She attended every charity gala with a practiced smile, gave interviews about women in leadership, while wearing designer gowns Alexander's assistant had chosen, and nodded politely when people said, "You're so lucky, he's brilliant, and he clearly adores you." But the truth lived in the quiet spaces between those words, in the way Alexander's hand would tighten around her wrist when she spoke too long to another man, or how he'd casually mention, over breakfast, that her old law firm had questionable ethics. Just days after she'd mentioned wanting to reconnect with a former mentor. One rainy Tuesday, she sat in their home office, reviewing documents for a pro bono case she'd secretly taken on, a single mother fighting eviction. Her heart raced with purpose. This was real. This mattered. Alexander walked in without knocking, holding 2 phones and a tablet. "What is this?" he asked, voice sharp. She looked up, startled. "Just some legal research." He stepped closer, eyes scanning the screen. "You're working?" On this? He gestured as if the screen were contaminated. Elena, we've talked about this. You don't need to do charity work. We are the charity. Our foundation gives millions. It's not about money, she said, closing the laptop slowly. It's about justice. He laughed, a short, hollow sound. Justice? You think justice exists outside a courtroom I can buy? The words landed like ice water down her spine. I'm not asking for your permission, she said, voice trembling but clear. I'm just doing what I trained for. Alexander set his devices down and leaned against the desk, arms crossed. His expression softened, but it wasn't warmth. It was strategy. Look, he said gently, I know you miss practicing law. So let's start something together. A Thorn Marquez initiative. You'll be the face, elegant, compassionate. We'll fund legal aid, name buildings after you. You'll have influence, Elena. Real influence. She stared at him. In that moment, she saw it all. The branding, the photo ops, the way her name would be polished into a logo while her actual voice stayed muffled beneath layers of PR. He wasn't offering her a platform. He was offering her a pedestal. And pedestals, she realized, are just cages with better lighting. I don't want to be the face of something you control, she whispered. I want to stand on my own feet. His smile faded. Your own feet are standing on floors I paid for. In a city I chose. With a life I built. The cruelty wasn't in the words themselves, but in how calmly he said them, as if stating facts, not wounds. That night, she tried calling her best friend from law school, Maya. The call went to voicemail. Again, she scrolled through her contacts, so many names, yet no one she could truly confide in without fear of it circling back to Alexander. He had a way of making everyone orbit him, even her friends. He's so generous, they'd say, and you two seem perfect. But perfection, she now understood, was just another kind of silence. A week later, at a dinner with investors, Alexander introduced her as my brilliant wife, though she's far too modest to practice law anymore. Says the world's too messy. He chuckled, patted her knee under the table. A gesture meant to look affectionate, but his fingers dug in just enough to sting. She smiled politely, but inside something cracked. Later, in the elevator ride up to their penthouse, she finally spoke. I want to go back to court. Full time. Alexander didn't look at her. He pressed the button for their floor, jaw tight. You know what happens if you do that, right? What happens? She asked, heart pounding. You stop being my partner, he said quietly, and become an inconvenience. The doors opened. He stepped out without looking back. She stood frozen in the elevator, the doors threatening to close. Then, with a shaky breath, she pressed door open and followed him inside. But something had shifted. The air between them was no longer warm. It was charged, brittle, like glass about to shatter. In the weeks that followed, Alexander grew colder, more distant. He stopped asking about her day, started scheduling business trips without telling her. When she tried to discuss it, he'd say, You're imagining things, Elena. Maybe you need a vacation. Or therapy. And that was the cruelest twist of all. He made her doubt her own pain. One evening, she found an email open on his laptop, left carelessly on the couch as if by design. It was to his financial advisor. Begin asset segregation. Prepare prenup enforcement clauses. She's getting ideas again. Her hands shook as she closed the lid. That night, she lay beside him in bed, listening to his steady breathing, and realized she was no longer sleeping next to her husband. She was sleeping next to a stranger who owned her address, her name, and soon, her past. The love hadn't vanished overnight. It had been eroded, grain, by control disguised as care, by generosity laced with ownership. And now, standing on the edge of that erosion, Elena knew. Staying would mean disappearing completely. But leaving would mean losing everything. From her first apartment, her grandmother's rosary, a journal filled with unsent letters to herself, and the emerald dress she'd worn the night, everything began to unravel. She left everything else, the designer shoes, the diamond earrings, the penthouse keys, on the marble counter. Alexander didn't yell when she told him. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the harbor as if watching a ship he knew would never return. You're making a mistake, he said, voice low, controlled. You think you'll walk away clean? You think the world will see you as anything but the woman who threw away $1 billion life. I'm not throwing it away, she replied, voice steadier than she felt. I'm walking toward myself. He turned then, eyes sharp, calculating. Then don't expect me to make it easy. She didn't flinch. I don't expect anything from you anymore. 2 weeks later, His lawyers came like wolves in tailored suits. They didn't just contest the divorce, they dismantled her. In court filings, they painted her as unstable, emotionally volatile, financially dependent. They subpoenaed her therapy records. She'd gone twice years ago after her mother's death. They claimed she'd abandoned marital duties by pursuing frivolous legal ambitions. And because their prenup was ironclad, drafted when she was 28, hopeful, and still believed love meant trust, she was entitled to nothing beyond what Alexander deemed reasonable. Reasonable? Her own lawyer whispered during a strategy session, shaking his head. Elena, he's offering you $200,000 and a used car. After 5 years of marriage. After you gave up your career to support his rise. She stared at the settlement sheet, the numbers blurring through tears she refused to shed in front of them. He knows I won't take it, she said quietly. Oh, he's counting on that, her lawyer replied grimly. Because if you fight, he'll drag this out for years, drain your savings, destroy your reputation, and in the end, you'll still get nothing. Or less. That night, she sat on the floor of her new studio apartment, a cramped space above a laundromat in Dorchester, the hum of dryers a constant lullaby. Rain tapped against the window. She opened her laptop and checked her bank account. $3,412. Her student loans were still active. Her credit score had taken a hit from joint account closures. And tomorrow, she had an interview at a legal aid clinic for a part-time paralegal role. She picked up her phone, dialed Maya. Elena. Maya's voice was hesitant, distant. I need a reference, Elena said simply. For a job. At the South End Legal Center. A pause. Then, softly. Alex called me last week. Said you were going through something. That you might reach out. Elena closed her eyes. Of course he had. Always one step ahead. Always weaving his narrative into every thread of her life. Did you believe him? She asked. Another silence. Longer this time. I don't know what to believe anymore, Maya admitted. But I remember who you were before him. And I hope you find her again. The call ended. Elena didn't cry. She couldn't afford to. Instead, she opened her bar exam review books, ones she'd kept in storage, and began highlighting passages with a trembling hand. Months passed in a blur of bus rides, instant coffee, and late nights studying under flickering fluorescent lights. She worked days at the clinic, filing motions, translating for immigrant clients, holding the hands of women too scared to speak. At night, she studied for the bar recertification exam. Because even though she'd never stopped being a lawyer in her soul, the state required proof she hadn't let her license gather dust. Alexander's name never appeared in her daily life, until it did. One afternoon, while waiting for the bus, she saw his face on a digital billboard above Copley Square. Thorne Innovations, building tomorrow, today. Smiling, confident, untouchable. Below it, a headline scrolled. Tech Titan finalizes divorce, moves forward with new chapter. Her stomach dropped. The divorce wasn't final. Not yet, but he'd already rewritten the story. That evening, she received an email from his attorney. My client insists you vacate the Dorchester residence within 30 days. Property records indicate the building is owned by Thorne Holdings LLC. He'd bought the block. Just to remind her, there was no corner of this city he couldn't reach. She stood on her fire escape that night, wind biting her cheeks, staring at the skyline where his penthouse glowed like a distant star. For the first time, rage flickered, not wild but cold-focused. Not the kind that burns you up, but the kind that forges you. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't beg. And she wouldn't disappear. Instead, she enrolled in night classes at Suffolk Law's judicial prep program. Took on extra shifts cleaning offices after hours. Ate rice and beans for weeks. And every Sunday, without fail, she wrote one page in her journal. Not about him, but about the woman she was becoming. For years. That's how long it would take, her mentor said, to rebuild enough credibility, enough experience, to even be considered for a judgeship. For years of silence, of work, of proving, not to Alexander, but to herself, that she was more than what he'd tried to erase. She looked up at the stars, whispered into the wind. Watch me. And somewhere, in a glass tower miles away, Alexander Thorne toasted to his new fiancée, unaware that the woman he'd left with nothing was already building a throne, not of gold, but of grit. The storm wasn't coming. Then finally to a tiny one-bedroom near the courthouse, close enough to walk, even in snow. Mornings began at 5 a.m. Coffee brewed on a hot plate, case files spread across the kitchen table, her old law books propped open with soup cans. By day, she worked as a legal clerk for a public defender's office, drafting motions, interviewing clients and holding cells that smelled of bleach and despair. By night, she studied judicial ethics, constitutional law, precedent after precedent, until her eyes burned and her hands cramped. She missed birthdays, holidays, the sound of her own laughter, but she never missed a deadline. One winter evening, her mentor, Judge Miriam Cole, a woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much, called her into chambers after court. "You've been submitting amicus briefs under your own name," Miriam said, not unkindly. Bold move for a clerk. Elena swallowed. "I thought, if I show I can think like a judge, maybe someone will see me as one." Miriam leaned back, steepling her fingers. "You know how rare it is for someone without political connections or Ivy League backing to get appointed. Especially after everything." Elena met her gaze. "I don't need them to see my past. I need them to see my work." Miriam studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "There's a vacancy opening in family court next year. Governor's looking for someone with real street experience, not just theory. Someone who understands what it means when custody isn't about rights, but about wounds." Elena's breath caught. Family court. The very place where marriages bled out and children became bargaining chips. The place where women like her once sat voiceless. "I'll apply," she said. "You'll do more than apply," Miriam replied. "You'll make them remember your name." Months later, after interviews, background checks, and a grueling panel review, Elena received the call. She was standing, in line at a bodega, buying instant noodles, when her phone rang. The number was blocked. "Ms. Marquez," a calm voice said, "the Judicial Nominating Commission has recommended you for appointment to the Massachusetts Probate and Family Court, pending final approval." She dropped the phone. It clattered on the wet sidewalk. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, as if the sky finally recognized her. She didn't cry. She just stood there, soaked, smiling at nothing and everything. 6 weeks later, she wore a simple black robe for the swearing-in ceremony. No gala, no champagne, just a small room, a few colleagues, and Judge Miriam placing a hand on her shoulder. "You earned this," Miriam whispered. "Not because you survived him, but because you refused to become him." Elena nodded, throat tight. She raised her right hand, repeated the oath, and felt something shift inside her. Not triumph, but peace. A quiet certainty that she hadn't just reclaimed her life. She'd redefined it. That night, alone in her apartment, she opened a bottle of cheap sparkling cider, the kind she used to drink before bar exams, and toasted to the girl who'd once believed love meant surrender. "You were wrong," she whispered to the empty room. "But you're forgiven." She didn't know it yet, but Alexander Thorne was watching. Not in person, but through headlines. Former corporate attorney appointed to family court bench. His new fiancée, Lila, pointed it out over breakfast one morning, scrolling through her tablet. "Elena Marquez?" Lila frowned. Wasn't she married to someone famous? Alexander froze, fork halfway to his mouth. He clicked the article. Saw the photo, Elena, poised, eyes calm but unyielding, standing beside the governor. No smile, just dignity. He didn't say a word. But that night, he dreamed of the emerald dress. Of her standing by the window saying, "I want my voice back." And for the first time in years, he wondered if he'd made the gravest mistake of his life. Not in losing her, but in underestimating what she'd become once she was free. Meanwhile, Elena settled into her new role with quiet authority. She ruled fairly, spoke little, listened deeply. Parents wept in her courtroom, not from fear, but from being truly heard. Lawyers respected her. Clerks admired her. And though whispers followed her, "She's the one Thorne divorced, you know," she never acknowledged them. Because she wasn't Elena Marquez, ex-wife of a billionaire. She was Judge Marquez. And justice, she now knew, wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Because just as she was finding her rhythm, a new case landed on her docket. Petitioner, Lila Thorne. Respondent, Alexander Thorne. Matter, custody of minor child, Julian Thorne, age 3. Her blood turned to ice. She read the file twice, then a third time. There was no mistake. Clutching a stuffed bear, blissfully unaware that his parents' war was about to spill into a courtroom. And that courtroom would be hers. By dawn, she'd made coffee 3 times, reheated it twice, and paced her small living room until her feet ached. She stood before the mirror, robe draped over her arm, and whispered, You are not that woman anymore. You are not broken. You are not afraid. But her hands trembled. At the courthouse, she moved through routine motions, signing orders, reviewing calendars, but her mind raced. Should she recuse herself? It was the safe choice. The expected one. No one would question it. In fact, they might expect it. But then what? Alexander would get another judge, someone he could charm, impress, or quietly influence. Someone who hadn't watched him reduce a brilliant woman to silence. Someone who didn't know how carefully he built walls around people while calling it love. She thought of Julian, of the custody evaluator's note. Father provides materially but is emotionally distant. Child seeks reassurance repeatedly, just like she once had. By mid-morning, she called her clerk into chambers. Pull every precedent on judicial impartiality in cases involving prior personal history, she said, voice steady. And schedule an in-chambers conference with both counsel. Today. Her clerk hesitated. Your Honor, are you sure? The respondent is. I know who he is, Elena cut in gently. That's why I need to be sure. An hour later, she sat alone in her chambers, sunlight streaming through tall windows, casting long shadows across the wood-paneled walls. She opened the file again. Read Lila's affidavit. He cancels visits for board meetings. He calls nannies temporary mothers. He says emotions are inefficient. The words echoed like ghosts from her own past. A knock at the door. Enter. Her clerk stepped in, followed by two attorneys. One sleek and polished in a navy suit, the other younger, earnest, clutching a worn leather briefcase. Your Honor, the first said smoothly. I'm Daniel Reeves, representing Mr. Thorne. May I say it's an honor. Elena gave no reaction. And you? Meera Patel, for Ms. Thorne, the younger woman said, voice firm despite the slight shake in her hands. Elena nodded. Sit. They did. I've reviewed the docket, she began, folding her hands. And I'm aware of my prior connection to Mr. Thorne. Before we proceed, I want both of you to understand this. If either party believes my impartiality may reasonably be questioned, I will recuse myself without hesitation. Silence. Reeves exchanged a glance with Patel, then cleared his throat. With all due respect, Your Honor, Mr. Thorne has full confidence in the court's integrity. Elena's pulse spiked, but she kept her face still. Does he? Yes, ma'am. She turned to Patel. And your client? Patel met her gaze directly. Ms. Thorne believes justice is best served by a judge who understands the patterns of emotional neglect, even when they're hidden behind wealth. Elena looked down. A beat passed. Then another. Very well, she said finally. We proceed. But let me be clear. This courtroom is not a stage for reputations. It's a sanctuary for truth. And for this child. She tapped Julian's photo lightly. His well-being is the only interest that matters here. Not pride. Not power. Not the past. She stood. Prepare for preliminary hearing tomorrow at 9 a.m. dismissed. As they left, Reeves paused at the door. For what it's worth, Your Honor, he's changed. Elena didn't look up. People don't change because they want to, she said softly. They change when they have to. The door clicked shut. Alone again, she walked to the window and stared out at the city. The same skyline she'd once watched from a penthouse, feeling like a ghost in her own life. Now, she stood in robes, not diamonds, and for the first time, she felt real. But beneath the calm, a storm brewed. Because tomorrow, Alexander Thorne would walk into her courtroom. Not as her husband, not as her enemy, but as a father pleading for a second chance. And she, Judge Elena Marquez, would have to decide whether redemption was possible or just another performance. She touched the gavel on her desk. Cold, heavy, final. Somewhere across town, Alexander stood in Julian's nursery, watching his son sleep. He smoothed the boy's hair, whispered, I won't lose you too. He didn't know it yet, but the real trial wasn't about custody. It was about whether a man who spent a lifetime controlling outcomes could finally surrender to consequence. And whether a woman who'd been erased could wield power without becoming the very thing she once fled. The gavel hadn't fallen yet. Elena sat elevated, robe crisp, hands folded over the bench, eyes fixed on the double doors. She'd arrived an hour early, reviewed every exhibit, reread Julian's developmental report, even memorized the nanny's deposition. Control was her armor now. Not coldness, clarity. Then the doors opened. Alexander walked in. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, hair slightly tousled, as if he'd rushed. But his posture was rigid, his gaze scanning the room until it landed on her. For a fraction of a second, his breath hitched. He hadn't seen her in 4 years, not truly. Not since she'd stood in their foyer with one suitcase and eyes full of quiet fire. Now, she looked down at him from the bench, expression unreadable. "Be seated," she said, voice calm, resonant, carrying just enough weight to remind everyone, including him, who held authority here. He took his place beside Daniel Reeves, but didn't look away. Not yet. Lila entered moments later, elegant in cream linen, holding Julian's tiny hand. The boy clung to her leg, wide-eyed, sucking his thumb. Elena's chest tightened. She forced herself to breathe. "Counsel," she began. "This is a preliminary hearing to establish temporary custody arrangements pending full evaluation. Ms. Patel, you may proceed." Meera Patel stood, composed but visibly nervous. "Thank you, Your Honor. My client seeks primary physical custody due to Mr. Thorne's consistent pattern of emotional unavailability. He missed 7 of the last 10 scheduled visits. When present, he delegates caregiving to staff. In his own words during deposition, love is shown through provision, not presence." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Reporters, curious clerks, 1 or 2 social workers. Elena turned her gaze to Alexander. "Respondent, do you dispute this characterization?" He rose slowly. His voice, once so commanding in boardrooms, was quieter now, measured, almost hesitant. "I provided everything Julian could need. Private tutors. The best pediatricians. A home with gardens, security, stability. And affection?" Elena asked, not unkindly, but with surgical precision. "Did you provide that?" Alexander faltered. I show it in my way." "In your way," she repeated softly. "Or in the way you were shown?" The question hung like smoke. Reeves shifted uncomfortably. "Objection, Your Honor." "Relevance." "Overruled," Elena said without looking at him. "The court is assessing parental capacity, which includes emotional attunement." "Respondent, answer the question." Alexander exhaled, looked down at his hands that had once signed billion-dollar deals, now twisting slightly. "My father never hugged me. Said emotions made men weak. I thought I was doing better, giving more than I had." Elena held his gaze. "But did you give what he needs?" Silence. Julian tugged Lila's sleeve. "Mama, why is that man sad?" Lila shushed him gently, but Elena heard. And something cracked inside her. Not pity, but recognition. This wasn't just about custody. It was about breaking cycles. She turned to the evaluator's report. Dr. Lin notes Julian exhibits separation anxiety and seeks constant reassurance. He calls his nanny mommy when distressed. That's not a failure of staff. It's a child's cry for consistent emotional safety. She paused, then addressed both parents. Temporary custody will be granted to Ms. Chen Thorne. Respondent may have supervised visitation twice weekly, limited to 2 hours, at a licensed family center. No nannies. No assistants. Just you and your son. Alexander paled. Supervised? Your Honor, I'm his father. And fathers don't earn that title by biology. Alone, she said, voice firm but not cruel. They earn it by showing up. Fully. Consistently. Without an audience. He stared at her, stunned. Not angry, wounded. As if, for the first time, he saw the cost of his choices reflected not in stock prices or headlines, but in a 3-year-old's anxious eyes. As the hearing adjourned, Lila squeezed Julian's hand and whispered, "We're going home, baby." Alexander remained seated, head bowed. Reeves gathered files, then hesitated. He's not the man he was, Judge. Elena stood, robe sweeping behind her. People change, she said quietly, when they finally see what they've lost. She turned to leave, but stopped when she heard his voice, low, raw, barely audible. Elena, she didn't turn. Couldn't. I didn't know, he said. I swear, I didn't know it felt like this. For a heartbeat, she was back in that penthouse, asking him to see her, and being met with charm instead of truth. But this time, she wasn't asking. She was judging. And justice, she realized, wasn't about making him suffer. It was about giving Julian a chance to be loved differently. She walked out without another word. Behind her, Alexander watched her go. Not with resentment, but with dawning horror at the mirror she'd held up to his soul. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft, cleansing. And somewhere in that courthouse, a little boy whispered, "Is that lady nice?" Lila looked toward the empty bench. "Yes, sweetheart," she said. "She's very nice." Unseen, Elena leaned against the hallway wall, closed her eyes, and let one tear fall. Not for the past, but for the future, his, hers, and the fragile hope that some wounds, when she saw Julian every Thursday and Saturday at the Family Connection Center, a sunlit space with toys, books, and counselors who watched quietly from the corners. Alexander always arrived early, dressed carefully, hands empty of phones or assistants. He'd kneel to Julian's level, awkward at first, then slowly learning how to listen without fixing, how to sit in silence without filling it with gifts. One afternoon, Elena reviewed visitation logs after court. The counselor's note read, "Father attempted to take child to helipad for special outing. Redirected. Child became distressed when told no helicopter. Father complied without protest, first time." She underlined the last sentence, then closed the file. That evening, as she walked home beneath a bruised twilight sky, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. Elena. His voice, Alexander's, was quiet, stripped of its usual polish. "Can we talk?" "Not in court. Just talk." Her pulse jumped, but she kept walking. "This isn't appropriate, Alexander." "I know," he said quickly. "But it's about Julian. Not me. Not us. Him." She stopped beneath a street lamp, rain beginning to mist around her. "What about him? He asked me today if you were his new mommy." The words landed like stones in her chest. "He saw your picture on the center's wall, the judge's board." He pointed and said, "That's the nice lady who helps me stay with Mama." Alexander's voice cracked. "Then he asked if you loved him." Elena closed her eyes. "What did you say?" "I didn't know what to say. So I told him. She loves all children who need help." A pause. "But I think he wanted more." Silence stretched between them, filled only by distant traffic and the soft patter of rain. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked finally. "Because I'm failing," he admitted raw. "I follow every rule you set. I show up. I don't bring toys. I just sit." But he still flinches when I reach for him. And I don't know how to fix that. Money can't buy trust, Elena. And I never learned how to build it. She leaned against a brick wall, heart pounding. This wasn't the Alexander who'd once rewritten reality to suit his narrative. This was a man unraveling, genuinely, painfully, trying to stitch himself back together for someone else. "You don't fix it," she said softly. "You earn it, day by day, even when it hurts, even when he doesn't smile, even when you feel like walking away." "I won't walk away," he said fiercely. "Not this time." She believed him, and that scared her more than his arrogance ever had. The next morning, a sealed envelope appeared on her desk, delivered by hand, no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper. "I've enrolled in parenting classes. Started therapy. Ask Lila for honest feedback, even when it stings. I'm not doing this for the case. I'm doing it because I looked in Julian's eyes yesterday and saw myself at 5 years old, waiting for someone to choose me." She read it 3 times, then locked it in her desk drawer. But fate wasn't done weaving threads. 2 days later, Lila Chinthorne requested an emergency hearing. Elena scanned the motion. Respondent took child off approved premises during visit. Violated supervision protocol. Her stomach dropped. She called the center immediately. "Yes, Your Honor," the director confirmed, voice tight. Mr. Thorne took Julian to the Boston Public Library. Said it was educational. Staff tried to stop him. He insisted it was safe. Stayed 20 minutes. Technically not abduction, but a clear breach. At the emergency hearing, Lila stood trembling. "He's manipulating the system. First helicopters, now libraries? What's next, a weekend in Aspen?" Alexander rose, pale but composed. "It was raining. Julian loves books. The library is 2 blocks away." I held his hand the entire time. "No media. No staff. Just us. And you thought that was acceptable?" Elena asked, voice low. "I thought it was human," he said. "Rules are important, but so is connection. I didn't want another hour of sitting in a room pretending to play while he watches the clock." Lila shot back. "You're romanticizing control." "No," Alexander said, turning to her, pained. "I'm trying not to repeat it." Elena studied them both, the fear in Lila's eyes, the desperation in Alexander's posture. And beneath it all, Julian, caught in the crossfire of adult wounds. She leaned forward. Effective immediately, all visits suspended for 14 days. Respondent will submit to a full psychological evaluation focused on boundary recognition and emotional regulation. Ms. Chinthorne, you will allow one 10-minute video call per week. No recording, no scripting. Let him hear his father's voice, even if they can't touch. Lila opened her mouth to protest, but Elena raised a hand. This isn't punishment, she said, gaze sweeping the room. It's recalibration. Because right now, both of you are fighting ghosts, and Julian is paying the price. As the courtroom emptied, Alexander lingered by the door. He didn't approach the bench. Just looked at her, eyes glistening. You're giving me a chance, he said quietly. I'm giving Julian a chance, she corrected. Don't confuse the two. He nodded slowly. Fair. And for the first time, he walked away without looking back, not in defeat but in resolve. That night, Elena sat alone in her apartment, rain tapping the windows again. She opened her journal. Wrote only one line. Justice isn't clean. It's messy, human, and sometimes it leaves room for grace. Outside, the city slept. But inside a library 2 blocks from a supervised visitation center, a little boy's favorite book, The Giving Tree, sat on a shelf waiting. He vanished into silence, as if respecting the boundary she'd drawn not just as a judge, but as a woman who'd once been erased by his noise. Then, on the morning of the 15th day, her clerk slipped a sealed envelope onto her desk during morning prep. No name. Just her initials in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single photograph. Julian, sitting cross-legged on a rug, holding a crayon drawing. The paper read in wobbly letters, Dad plus me plus tree. Beneath it, scribbled an adult hand. He drew this after our last video call. He asked me to give it to the nice lady who helps. Elena's breath caught. She traced the child's clumsy son with her thumb, heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't evidence. It wasn't strategy. It was vulnerability, offered without demand. She locked the photo in her drawer, next to his letter. But fate had sharper teeth. That afternoon, as she reviewed the psychological evaluator's report, subject demonstrates genuine insight into past relational patterns, exhibits motivation for change, though emotional regulation remains fragile. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I need to see you. Not in court. Please. She deleted it, then stared at the blank screen for 10 full seconds before typing back, against every protocol, against every instinct that had kept her safe. Where? 30 minutes later, she stood outside a quiet cafe near the Charles River. Neutral ground, public daylight. She wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a cream sweater, hair pulled back. No robe. No gavel. Just Elena. He was already there, sitting at a corner table, hands wrapped around a mug. He looked thinner. Older. His eyes lifted when she entered, and for a moment neither moved. She sat across from him. Didn't order. Didn't speak. I know I shouldn't have asked, he began, voice rough. But I'm losing him, Elena. Not legally. Spiritually. He looks at me like I'm a stranger who knows his name. She kept her hands folded. You built a life where love was transactional. Now you're shocked it doesn't transfer to a child who only wants your presence. I'm trying, he said, desperation bleeding through. Therapy. Parenting classes. I read to him over the calls. Same book every night. Goodnight Moon. He used to fall asleep before I finished. Now he stays awake just to say again. But then he whispers, Is the nice lady listening? Elena's throat tightened. He's not talking about me. He's talking about safety. And you keep testing its edges. I'm not testing, he insisted, leaning forward. I'm learning. But how do I prove I've changed when every move I make is seen as manipulation? When my money, my name, my past, they're all weapons against me now. Then stop fighting like you're in a boardroom, she said quietly. This isn't about winning. It's about showing up, even when you don't get applause, even when he doesn't hug you back. He looked down, jaw clenched. What if I'm too late? You're not, she said, and the words surprised even her. But you have to stop seeing Julian as your second chance to fix your life. He's not your redemption. He's a person, and he needs a father, not a project. Silence settled between them, softer now. Less charged. Then softly. Do you ever think about us? She met his eyes. I think about the woman I was, and I'm grateful she survived you. He flinched, but didn't argue. I deserved that. Yes, she said. You did. A pause. Rain began to patter against the windows. I'm scared, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Not of losing custody. Of losing him forever. Of him growing up thinking I never really saw him. Elena studied him. The man who once commanded rooms with a glance, now sitting small, open, trembling on the edge of something real. Then let him see you, she said. Not the billionaire. Not the ex-husband. Just the man who's trying. Flaws and all. He nodded slowly, tears glistening but not falling. Thank you. For what? For not letting me off the hook. And for not throwing me away. She stood. Don't thank me. Thank Julian. He's the one giving you a chance. As she turned to leave, he called out, Elena? She paused. If things were different, would we have made it? She didn't turn. Just said, we weren't broken because of circumstance, Alexander. We were broken because you refused to see me as whole. But maybe you can learn to see him. And with that, she walked out into the rain. Back at the courthouse, she reopened Julian's file. Attached a new note to the record. Not for the lawyers, but for herself. Progress isn't linear. But it's possible. Even for those who once believed love was a contract. That evening, Alexander didn't go home. He went to the library. Sat in the children's section. Read Goodnight Moon aloud to an empty chair. And for the first time, he didn't care who was watching. He only cared that somewhere, a little boy might feel heard. Meanwhile, Elena stood at her window, watching the river flow beneath streetlights, wondering if justice could sometimes look like mercy. And if mercy, in Alexander clearly now, not as the man who destroyed her, but as a flawed father trying clumsily, desperately to rebuild. And that made everything harder. Because impartiality wasn't about numbness. It was about seeing truth without distortion, and acting on it, even when it hurt. She sat in chambers, reviewing the updated visitation logs. Julian had drawn another picture, this time of 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. At the bottom, in Lila's handwriting, he says the middle one is you, Judge. Elena closed the file, pressed her palms to her eyes. A knock. Enter. Her clerk stepped in, face tight. Your Honor, Mr. Thorne's counsel just filed an emergency motion. For what? He's requesting you recuse yourself. Her blood ran cold. On what grounds? Alleged emotional entanglement. Cites your private meeting at the cafe. She went still. Who told them? I don't know. But it's in the filing. They're asking for immediate reassignment. Silence stretched. Outside, rain began to fall. She stood slowly, walked to the window. The city blurred through glass. Of course he'd done it. Not Alexander Reeves. The lawyer, protecting his client by attacking the one variable he couldn't control, her integrity. But the irony was brutal. She hadn't met Alexander to sway the case. She'd met him to save it, from becoming another battlefield where Julian lost. Now her credibility hung by a thread. She turned. Schedule a sealed-in chambers hearing. Today. Both counsel. No parties present. Yes, Your Honor. An hour later, Reeves and Patel stood before her, tension thick enough to choke on. Mr. Reeves, Elena began, voice calm as stone. You've accused this court of impropriety based on a 10-minute conversation at a public cafe. Do you have evidence of influence? Of favoritism? Of any ruling altered due to personal contact? Reeves shifted. Your Honor, perception is reality in judicial ethics. The appearance of partiality is not the same as actual bias, she cut in. I've ruled against your client twice. Restricted his access. Required psychological evaluation. If I were compromised, wouldn't I have bent the rules in his favor? Reeves hesitated. Perhaps, but emotions run deep. Then let me be clear, she said, leaning forward. My emotions are my own. My rulings belong to the law. And if you believe otherwise, file a formal ethics complaint. But don't weaponize my humanity to undermine a child's stability. She turned to Patel. Ms. Chinthorne's position? Patel met her gaze. My client trusts the court's fairness. She believes Julian needs consistency, not a new judge who doesn't know his fears, his routines, or the progress his father's actually made. Elena nodded, then looked back at Reeves. Motion to recuse is denied. The case remains here. And if either side leaks details of that meeting to the press, I will hold you in contempt so fast, your headlines won't dry before you're fined. They left in silence. But the damage was done. That afternoon, as she walked to her car, a reporter stepped out from behind a pillar. Judge Marquez, can you comment on allegations of a secret relationship with Alexander Thorne? She didn't stop. No comment. Is it true you're giving him special treatment? She turned, eyes blazing. The only special treatment in this case is the court's unwavering focus on a 3-year-old boy who deserves more than adult drama. Now step aside. She drove home in silence, hands gripping the wheel. Her phone buzzed Alexander. She almost didn't answer. Did you see the news? He asked, voice urgent. I'm not talking to you about this. Elena, I didn't authorize that motion. Reeves acted alone. I swear. She exhaled sharply. It doesn't matter. The seed's been planted. I'll fire him. Today. And replace him with someone else who'll play the same game? No. She paused. This isn't about you anymore, Alexander. It's about whether Julian gets a stable process or becomes tabloid fodder. He was quiet for a long moment. Then softly, what do I do? Show up. Follow the rules. Let your actions speak louder than your lawyers. Another pause. You're still giving me a chance. I'm giving Julian a chance, she repeated, the words now a mantra. Don't make me regret it. That night, she sat at her desk, staring at the gavel. For the first time, doubt crept in, not about her fairness, but about the cost of staying. Was her presence helping or hurting? She opened her journal. Wrote, I swore to uphold justice, not avoid scrutiny. If I step down now, I teach Julian that power retreats when challenged. But if I stay, I must be flawless. Not for them. For him. Outside, thunder rolled. And in a penthouse across town, Alexander deleted Reeves' number, typed a new email. Effective immediately, I represent myself in all matters concerning my son. No more strategy. Just truth. He didn't know if it would help. But for the first time, he chose integrity over advantage. And somewhere between their separate storms, a little boy slept, dreaming of stick-figure families and rainbows. Unaware that two broken adults were fighting, the clasp at her neck. She'd barely slept. Not from fear of judgment, but from the weight of knowing that today's decision would echo in Julian's life for decades. And in hers. She hadn't spoken to Alexander since their last call. He'd filed his own brief, handwritten, unpolished, raw. No legal jargon, just pages of honest reflection. I used to measure success in exits and valuations. Now I measure it in bedtime stories finished, in small hands that no longer pull away. She'd read it 3 times. Each time, her chest ached, not with old wounds, but with something new, hope fragile as a bird's wing. At the courthouse, the air crackled. Reporters lined the steps, cameras ready. She walked through them without pause, eyes forward, heart steady. Inside, the courtroom was packed, not with spectators, but with silence. Lila sat on one side, back straight, holding Julian's favorite stuffed bear in her lap. Alexander sat alone on the other, no lawyer, no entourage. Just him, in a simple navy suit, eyes fixed on the bench. He looked up as she entered. Their gazes met. No anger, no plea, just recognition. 2 people who had once shared a life, now sharing a moment that could heal or haunt. Be seated, she said, voice resonant, calm. The hearing began with Lila's testimony. She spoke clearly, lovingly, but with steel beneath her words. He provides toys, not time. He schedules bonding like a meeting. Julian comes home confused, happy for the gifts, sad because Daddy left again. Then it was Alexander's turn. He rose slowly. Didn't approach the witness stand right away. Just stood, looking at Julian's empty chair in the gallery, placed there by court order, so he could imagine his son listening. I used to think love was legacy, he began, voice quiet but carrying. Buildings with your name. Companies that outlive you. But Julian, he doesn't care about my name. He cares if I'm there when he wakes up scared. If I laugh at his silly jokes. If I stay, even when I'm tired, even when I don't know what to say. He turned to Elena. You asked me once if I gave him what he needs. The truth is, I didn't know how. My father taught me that strength meant silence. That affection was weakness. I thought providing everything meant I loved him enough. His voice cracked. But love isn't everything you give. It's everything you're willing to feel with them. Lila wiped her eyes. Even Reeves, watching from the back row, looked away. Elena kept her expression neutral, but inside something shifted. This wasn't performance. This was surrender. Why should the court trust you now? She asked, not as an accuser, but as a guardian. Because I'm not asking for trust, he said. I'm asking for a chance to earn it. Day by day. Mistake by mistake. And if I fail, hold me accountable. But don't let my past steal his future. Silence filled the room like breath held too long. Then Elena did something unprecedented. She stepped down from the bench. Not far, just enough to stand at eye level with him, in the well of the court. Gasps rippled through the room. Look at me, Alexander, she said softly. He did. Do you understand that custody isn't a prize? It's a responsibility. One you can't delegate, monetize, or charm your way into. Yes, he whispered. And if I grant you shared custody, you will follow every condition, therapy, visitation logs, no unsupervised travel, no media exposure, without exception. I swear it. She held his gaze another beat, then returned to the bench. The rest of the hearing blurred. Expert testimonies, closing arguments, the soft rustle of papers. But everyone knew. The verdict had already been spoken in that moment of human truth. When court adjourned for deliberation, Elena retreated to her chambers. She didn't review files. She closed her eyes and saw Julian's drawings, the tree, the rainbow, the three stick figures. She picked up her pen and wrote the order not as a judge punishing a man, but as a woman who understood redemption. When she returned, the courtroom was hushed. "Mr. Thorne," she began, "you have demonstrated significant, though incomplete, growth. Ms. Thorne, your stability and attunement are commendable. Therefore, the court orders joint legal custody, with primary physical custody remaining with Ms. Thorne." Alexander's shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but relief. He hadn't expected more. "But," Elena continued, "supervised visitation is lifted effective immediately. You will have unsupervised weekends, alternating holidays, and summer weeks, contingent upon continued participation in family therapy and monthly parenting evaluations." Lila's breath caught. Alexander looked up, stunned. "You're giving me real time with him? You've earned the chance," Elena said. "Don't waste it." As the gavel fell, soft, final, he didn't smile. He just nodded, tears in his eyes, and whispered, "Thank you." Later, as the crowd dispersed, he lingered by the door. She was gathering her files when he approached, careful to stay outside the bar. "I won't let you down," he said. "I know," she replied, "because this isn't about me anymore." He hesitated. "Will I see you again?" "Only if Julian draws another picture with 3 people," she said gently. "And even then, I'll be the lady in the robe. Nothing more." He smiled faintly. "That's enough." And as he walked away, Elena finally exhaled. She hadn't sought revenge. She hadn't granted absolution. She'd done something harder. She'd made space for change. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds. Quiet Saturdays at the park, Sunday pancakes, bedtime stories read over video when he traveled for work. Julian began to smile when he arrived. Once he even ran to him. But Elena watched from afar, not as a judge now, but as a woman who knew how easily old patterns could resurface. Then came the first real test. It was a Thursday evening. Rain lashed against the courthouse windows as Elena reviewed final orders for the week. Her clerk knocked softly. "Your Honor, Mr. Thorne is here." Unannounced. She looked up. "In the courtroom?" "No, in the lobby. Says it's urgent. About Julian." Her pulse quickened. "Send him in." Moments later, Alexander stepped into her chambers soaked, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes wide with panic. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a sweater, jeans, the kind of clothes a father wears when he's been playing on the floor with his son. "Elena, Judge, I'm sorry to come like this, but I didn't know who else to call." She gestured to a chair. "Sit." "What happened?" He sank into it, hands shaking. "Julian, he fell. At the playground. Hit his head. They took him to Mass General. Lila's with him. But the doctors said he might have a concussion. And they're asking about medical consent forms. And I don't have them. Lila has primary physical custody, so the hospital won't let me authorize anything beyond basic care." His voice cracked. "I stood there, Elena, holding my son while he cried, and they told me I couldn't sign for a CT scan. Because on paper, I'm not primary. I'm just secondary." The raw pain in his voice wasn't performative. It was the agony of a father rendered powerless by the very system meant to protect his child. Elena stood slowly. "Did you call Lila?" "She's signing now." But it took 20 minutes. 20 minutes where Julian was scared, and I couldn't do anything. He looked up, eyes glistening. "I followed every rule. I showed up. I changed. But the system still treats me like a visitor in my own son's life." She didn't speak for a long moment. Then walked to her desk, opened Julian's file, and pulled out the joint legal custody order. Joint legal custody means you share decision-making authority on medical, educational, and religious matters, she said firmly. The hospital erred. "You absolutely have the right to consent." "But they didn't see it that way," he whispered. And in that moment, I felt like the man I used to be, the one who thought control was love. Because all I wanted was to fix it, to make them listen. But I couldn't. And I realized, maybe this is what you felt. When I took your choices away. The words hung between them, heavy with truth. Elena sat across from him. You're not that man anymore, Alexander. Am I not? He looked down. Because standing there, helpless, all I could think was, if I had full custody, this wouldn't happen. And that's the same arrogance that ruined us. She studied him. The genuine remorse, the fear, the dawning humility. This wasn't a billionaire trying to win. This was a father learning to serve. I'll call the hospital, she said finally. Clarify the order. And I'll issue a supplemental directive tomorrow. Both parents have equal emergency medical authority. No delays. No gatekeeping. Relief flooded his face. Thank you. But she held up a hand. Don't thank me. Thank yourself for staying. For choosing Julian over your ego. He nodded, then stood to leave. At the door, he paused. He asked for you. Elena froze. What? When he was crying, before the scan, he kept saying, "Where's the nice lady? She makes things fair." Her breath caught. She looked away, blinking fast. Alexander didn't move. He sees you as his protector. I'm not his protector, she said softly. I'm just someone who tried to make sure he had a chance to be loved well. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you did more than that. You gave me a mirror. And for the first time, I didn't look away. She met his eyes. Go be with him. He left without another word. That night, Elena sat alone in her apartment, rain still tapping the windows. She opened her journal. Wrote only, "Justice isn't always about rulings. Sometimes it's about creating space for broken people to become whole, for their children's sake." The next morning, she issued the supplemental order and added a footnote, not for the record but for herself. Parenthood isn't defined by titles. It's defined by presence. And sometimes presence begins with surrender. Across town, Alexander sat by Julian's hospital bed, holding his small hand as he slept. On the bedside table, a new drawing. 3 figures under a sun labeled in crayon. Mama plus Dada plus Judge Yele. He didn't erase it. He framed it. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Thorne understood. Love wasn't about ownership. It was about show-quiet vigilance, the way a gardener watches a fragile sapling after the first hard frost. Then came the school meeting. It was a crisp November afternoon when the call came. Julian's preschool teacher requested a joint parent conference. Both Lila and Alexander were to attend. But Lila was out of town. She called Elena directly, something she'd never done before. "Judge Marquez," Lila said, voice strained. "I know this is outside protocol, but would you consider attending? Just as an observer?" The teacher mentioned concerns about Julian's attachment behaviors. "And I trust your judgment more than any expert." Elena hesitated. "Lila, I can't insert myself into his daily life." "I'm not asking you to judge," Lila said softly. "I'm asking you to witness. For him." The request unsettled her. But that night, she dreamed of Julian's drawings, the 3 figures always holding hands. When she woke, she knew. She arrived at the school in plain clothes, sitting in the back of a sunlit classroom filled with tiny chairs and finger-painted masterpieces. Alexander was already there, kneeling beside Julian's cubby, helping him hang up his coat. The ease between them was new, natural, not rehearsed. The teacher, Ms. Rivera, spoke gently. "Julian is bright, affectionate, but he becomes very anxious during transitions. Drop-offs, pickups, he clings. And recently, he started saying things like, 'Is Dada going away again?'" Alexander's face fell. "I haven't missed a single visit." "I know," Ms. Rivera said kindly. "But children sense emotional uncertainty, even when adults think they're hiding it." Elena's chest tightened. She saw it then, not manipulation, not regression, but the echo of abandonment anxiety. Julian wasn't afraid his father would leave. He was afraid love itself was temporary. After the meeting, Alexander lingered by the playground, watching Julian swing. He didn't notice Elena approach. "He thinks love has an expiration date," he said quietly, still facing the swings. "Because mine did with you." She stopped beside him. "You didn't just leave me, Alexander. You made me feel invisible. And Julian senses that same fear in you. The fear that you're not enough unless you're in control." He turned to her, eyes raw. "How do I fix that?" "You don't fix it," she said. "You live differently. Every day. Show him that love stays, even when it's messy. Even when you're scared." He nodded slowly. Then, voice breaking. "What if I'm still that man underneath? What if I wake up one day and realize I've been pretending?" "Then you keep choosing better," she said. "Not for me. Not for the court. For him." A silence settled between them, softer now. Then Julian ran over, breathless, holding a dandelion gone to seed. "Dada!" Blow! Alexander knelt, took the stem, and blew gently. Seeds scattered like tiny parachutes. Julian giggled, then turned to Elena. Your turn, Judge Ella. She hesitated, but the boy's eyes were wide with trust. So she took the stem from Alexander's hand, their fingers brushing, just once, and blew. Seeds floated into the wind. Julian clapped. Now we all stay together. Alexander looked at her, tears in his eyes. He thinks you're part of us. I'm not, she said gently, but I'm glad he feels safe enough to imagine it. Later, as she walked back to the courthouse, her phone buzzed. A photo from Lila, Julian asleep in his bed, clutching the framed drawing of the three figures. Caption: he calls it our family. Thank you for seeing him. That evening, Elena stood on her balcony, city lights shimmering below. She thought of the woman who'd left a penthouse with one suitcase, convinced she'd lost everything. She hadn't. She'd just been making room. For justice, for grace, and for the quiet miracle of a little boy who believed love could include even those who once broke it. And somewhere, in a bedroom filled with stuffed animals and crayon dreams, Julian whispered into the dark. Good night, Judge Ella. But fate, it seemed, wasn't finished with her. It happened on a Thursday, the coldest day of the year. Snow fell in thick, muffled sheets as Elena walked home from court, collar turned up against the wind. Her phone buzzed inside her coat. Unknown number. Again. She almost ignored it. But some quiet pull made her answer. Elena. His voice was low, urgent, stripped bare. Please. I need to see you. Just 5 minutes. She stopped beneath a street lamp, snow catching in her hair. Alexander, the case is closed. You know I can't. It's not about the case, he cut in, voice cracking. It's about me. And I swear, I wouldn't ask if it weren't life or death. The rawness in his tone froze her more than the winter air. Where? She asked quietly. The old bench. By the river. Where we used to walk before everything. She shouldn't go. Every rule, every boundary she'd built said no. But the woman who'd once been erased knew the weight of being unheard. And the man on the other end sounded like he was drowning. 20 minutes later, she found him sitting on the wooden bench they'd shared years ago, back when love still felt like a promise. He wore no coat, just a sweater, shoulders hunched against the cold. Snow dusted his dark hair like ash. She sat beside him, careful to leave space between them. I got the final therapy evaluation today, he began without looking at her. Dr. Lin said I've made remarkable progress. That I'm fit for full co-parenting. He let out a hollow laugh. And all I could think was, what if I'm not? What if this is just another performance I've learned to perfect? She stayed silent, letting him unravel. I stood in Julian's room last night, he continued, voice trembling, watching him sleep. And I realized, I don't know how to be a father without trying to fix, control, impress. It's all I've ever known. And what terrifies me isn't losing him. It's becoming the kind of man who loves conditionally again. The kind who walks away when things get hard. He finally turned to her, eyes glistening with tears that didn't fall. You saw me at my worst. You saw how I treated you. Like your dreams were an inconvenience to my empire. And now, I look at Julian and I see you. Your strength. Your quiet fire. And I'm so afraid I'll crush that in him too. Elena's breath caught. This wasn't manipulation. This was confession. You're not him, she said softly. You're not your father. And you're not the man you were. But how do I know? He whispered. How do I trust myself when my entire life has been about winning, not loving? She looked out at the frozen river, ice glinting under streetlights. You don't trust yourself, she said. You trust him. Julian. You let his needs guide you. Not your fear, not your pride. When you're unsure, you ask, what does he need right now? Not what makes you look good. Not what soothes your guilt. Just what serves him. He nodded slowly, absorbing her words like parched earth. Then, voice barely audible. Do you ever forgive me? She turned to him then, really looked at him. Not as a defendant, not as a billionaire, but as a man kneeling in the ruins of his own making, offering his broken pieces without asking for them to be glued back together. I don't carry that anger anymore, she said. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because I deserve peace. A tear finally slipped down his cheek, vanishing into the snow. I miss you, he admitted. Not as my wife, but as the person who saw through me and still believed I could be better. I never believed it, she said gently. I just refused to let you convince me otherwise. They sat in silence as snow fell around them, softening edges, covering old wounds with something clean. After a long while, he stood. Thank you for coming. She rose too. Don't thank me. Thank Julian. He's the reason you're fighting. He nodded. Then, hesitantly, can I write you? Just updates? Not to cross lines. Just so you know he's okay. She considered it, then gave a small nod. Once a month. No expectations. No replies unless I choose. He smiled faintly. That's more than I deserve. As he walked away, shoulders straighter now, she watched until he disappeared into the white haze. Back home, she lit a single candle, something she hadn't done in years. Not for ritual, just for warmth. And for the first time since the divorce, she allowed herself to remember the good moments too. His laughter over burnt pancakes, the way he'd held her hand during her mother's funeral, the rare nights when his armor slipped and he'd whispered, "Stay with me." She didn't mourn the marriage, but she honored the truth. People are never just one thing. Not villains. Not saints. Just humans trying, failing, trying again. Later that night, she opened her journal and wrote, "Redemption isn't a destination. It's a daily choice, to show up, even when you're afraid you'll fail. And sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is ask for help, especially when they've spent a lifetime pretending they didn't need it." CES laced with bitterness, adoptions filled with hope, custody battles where children were treated like assets. She ruled with the same clarity, the same quiet strength. But something had shifted inside her, a softening, not of judgment, but of heart. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, hand-delivered to her chambers in a cream envelope with no return address. Just her name, written in Alexander's now-familiar script. She almost didn't open it. But the weight of it, the simplicity, pulled at her. Inside, a single sheet, Elena Julian turned for last week. He asked for a family picnic. Just Mama, Dada, and Judge Ella. Lila said yes. I didn't dare hope you would. But if you're willing. Saturday, 2 p.m. at the public garden. We'll be by the Swan boats. No expectations. Just presence. Her hands trembled. This wasn't protocol. It wasn't appropriate. And yet, it was the purest thing she'd read in years. She didn't reply. But Saturday found her walking toward the public garden, heart pounding beneath a simple linen dress, hair loose, no robe, no title, just Elena. She saw them before they saw her. Lila sat on a checkered blanket, laughing as Julian chased pigeons. Alexander stood nearby, holding a paper bag of pastries, watching his son with a tenderness that made her chest ache. He looked up and froze. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Then Julian spotted her. "Judge Yele!" he shrieked, sprinting across the grass, arms wide. She knelt just in time to catch him in a hug that smelled of sunshine and strawberry jam. "You came," he whispered, squeezing tight. "I did," she said, voice thick. Alexander approached slowly, eyes searching hers. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said softly. "But he asked." Lila stood, smiling warmly. "We saved you a croissant." They sat together, not as exes, not as litigants, but as three adults orbiting a child who believed love could be shared, not divided. Julian chattered nonstop, about school, about his new blue shoes, about how the swans talked to him in secret. At one point, he climbed into Alexander's lap and whispered loudly, "Dada says you're the bravest lady he knows." Alexander flushed. "I may have mentioned that once." Elena looked at him, surprised. "Why?" "Because you gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one," he said simply. "And you never let me off the hook, even when it would have been easier." She held his gaze. Justice isn't easy, but it's necessary. After lunch, Julian tugged her hand. "Walk with us." She glanced at Lila and Alexander. They both nodded. So they strolled along the pond, Julian skipping between them, pointing at ducks, inventing stories about turtles. At one bend in the path, he grabbed both their hands, swinging between them like a pendulum of joy. And for a moment, just a moment, they were a family. Not legally, not romantically, but humanly. As the sun dipped low, casting gold across the water, Julian yawned and rubbed his eyes. Alexander scooped him up, cradling him gently against his chest. "He's asleep," Lila murmured. Elena stepped back. "I should go." But Julian stirred, blinking awake. "No. Stay." Alexander adjusted him in his arms. "Just a little longer," he said to her, voice tender. "He needs to see you leave, so he knows you'll come back." The words struck her like truth. So she walked with them to the car, stood beside Lila as Alexander buckled Julian in. The boy reached through the window, fingers brushing her sleeve. "Bye, Judge Ella." "Bye, Julian." As the car pulled away, Lila rolled down her window. "Thank you," she called. "For everything." Elena nodded, throat tight. Alone again, she stood by the empty path, watching the taillights disappear. The air smelled of wet grass and possibility. That night, she wrote in her journal, "Some wounds don't close. They transform. Into wisdom. Into boundaries. Into the courage to say yes when fear screams no." Today, I didn't give him a verdict. I gave him a memory. And maybe that's the truest form of justice of all. Back in his penthouse, Alexander tucked Julian into bed, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "She came." Julian smiled in his sleep. "Told you she would." And somewhere between the stars and the streetlights, a woman who once left with nothing finally understood. She hadn't lost her life that day. She'd been making room for grace, for growth, and for the quiet miracle of being Boston. Secret family affair. Judge oversees custody case. Then joins ex-husband for romantic picnic. Below it, a grainy photo. Elena kneeling in the grass, Julian hugging her, Alexander watching with what the caption called longing eyes. Her stomach dropped before she even finished reading. By noon, her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Ethics inquiries. Press requests. A formal complaint filed by a conservative legal watchdog group. The narrative was already set. She'd abused her position. Manipulated the system. Rekindled a relationship under the guise of judicial oversight. She sat in her chambers, blinds drawn, hands gripping the edge of her desk like it might anchor her to reality. This wasn't just scrutiny, it was erasure. Again, they weren't seeing a woman who'd upheld the law with integrity. They were seeing a story they wanted to believe. That power corrupts, that women can't be both strong and compassionate, that justice is never truly blind when emotions are involved. A knock. Enter. Her clerk stepped in, face pale. "Your Honor, the chief judge wants to see you." "Now." She stood without a word. In the chief's office, 2 senior judges sat waiting. No pleasantries. "Elena," Chief Justice Whitmore began, voice heavy, "this is serious. The appearance of impropriety, even if unfounded, undermines public trust. You know that." "I do," she said, voice steady despite the storm inside. "But I did nothing wrong. The picnic was a one-time child-initiated gathering," she cut in. "No legal discussion occurred. No favoritism shown. The custody order was finalized months ago. I attended as a human being, not a judge." And yet, one of the judges said coldly, "You allowed yourself to be photographed in an intimate setting with a former spouse whose case you presided over. That's not judgment, Elena. That's recklessness." She met his gaze. "Or it's humanity. Something this profession often forgets." Silence. Then Whitmore sighed. "We're placing you on administrative review. Pending investigation. You'll step down from all family court matters immediately." The words hit like ice water. "You're suspending me?" she whispered. "Precautionary," Whitmore said gently. "Just until this blows over." But she knew. It wouldn't blow over. Careers had been ended for less. That evening, she sat alone in her apartment, rain tapping the windows again. Always rain when her world cracked open. She stared at her robe hanging on the door, once a symbol of honor, now a target. Her phone buzzed. Alexander. She almost didn't answer. "Elena," he said, voice urgent. "I saw the headlines. I'm so sorry." "Don't," she cut in, voice raw. "Don't apologize for existing. For loving your son enough to include me in his world." "I should have protected you," he said. "I should have said no to the picnic." "No," she said fiercely. "You gave him joy. That's never wrong. But now you're paying for it." "Maybe," she whispered. "But I'd rather lose my title than betray his trust." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Let me fix this." "How?" "I'll hold a press conference. Tell the truth. That you never crossed a line. That I'm the one who asked you to come. That Julian needed you, and you showed up, even when it cost you." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Alexander, you don't owe me that. I owe Julian a world where kindness isn't punished," he said softly. "And I owe you the truth." The next morning, he did it. Standing on the courthouse steps, not as a billionaire, but as a father, he faced the cameras alone. "My son asked for a picnic with 3 people he loves," he said, voice clear, calm. "One of them happened to be the judge who ensured he'd have a fair chance at a whole life. She didn't attend as a judge. She attended as a human being who said yes to a child's heart. If that's a scandal, then we've lost our way." He paused, looked directly into the lens. "And if anyone tries to punish her for showing up with compassion, They'll have to go through me. The statement went viral. Within hours, support poured in, former clients, colleagues, even strangers sharing stories of judges who'd shown them mercy. The narrative shifted. Not because of money or influence, but because a little boy's innocent request had exposed something deeper. The hunger for humanity in a broken system. 3 days later, the ethics committee dropped the complaint. Elena returned to the bench. But everything had changed. Because now the world didn't just see a judge. They saw a woman who chose love over fear, even when it cost her everything. And that night, as she stood on her balcony watching the city lights flicker to life, she realized she hadn't just survived the storm. She'd become part of the shelter. Somewhere across town, Julian slept peacefully, unaware that his simple wish had sparked a quiet revolution. And in his room, taped to the wall beside his drawings, was a new photo, taken by a passerby that day at the public garden. 3 figures, smiling in the sun. Impartial and human. Then, on a humid August morning, a sealed envelope arrived in her chambers. Not from counsel. Not from the court clerk. From Lila. Inside, a handwritten note. Judge Marquez, Julian starts kindergarten next week. He's nervous. Keeps asking if Judge Ella will be there on the first day. I told him I'd ask. No pressure. Just, he believes you make hard things safe. Lila Elena read it 3 times. Her chest tightened. This wasn't protocol. It was something deeper. Trust offered without strings. She didn't reply in writing. Instead, she showed up. On the first day of school, she stood near the gate of Brookline Elementary. Not in robes, not as a judge, but in a simple sundress, hair loose, holding a small backpack she'd bought the night before. Inside, crayons, a notebook, and a smooth river stone she'd painted with a tiny sun. For when you miss me, she'd written on a tag. Julian spotted her instantly. Judge Ella. He sprinted across the yard, backpack bouncing, eyes wide with joy. She knelt and opened her arms. Happy first day. He hugged her fiercely. You came. I promised, didn't I? He pulled back, serious now. Will you stay until I go in? Of course. She walked with him and his parents to the classroom door. Lila squeezed her arm in silent thanks. Alexander stood slightly apart, watching her with an expression she couldn't name. Gratitude, awe, maybe grief for all the years he'd wasted. At the threshold, Julian turned. Dada says you're the reason we're a family now. Alexander flushed. I may have said that. Elena looked at him, then at Julian. Families aren't made by courts, she said softly. They're made by showing up, even when it's hard. Julian nodded solemnly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I drew this for you. She opened it. A new picture. 4 figures this time. Mama, Dada, Julian, and a tall woman with a gavel, standing beside them like a guardian angel. At the bottom, in wobbly letters, our judge. She stays. Tears pricked her eyes. She crouched to his level. Thank you, Julian. I'll keep it forever. The teacher called the class inside. Julian hesitated, then whispered, Will you be here when I come out? She touched his cheek. Not today, but I'll be right here. She tapped his chest. In your brave place. He smiled, took a deep breath, and walked in. As the door closed behind him, Alexander stepped closer. You didn't have to do this. I know, she said. But he needed to see that love doesn't disappear when the gavel falls. They stood in silence for a moment, the schoolyard emptying around them. Then quietly, Do you ever wonder what our life would have been like if I'd seen you sooner? She looked at him, really looked. The arrogance was gone. In its place, humility, presence, a man who'd learned to love without owning. We can't rewrite the past, she said gently. But we gave him a future where love isn't conditional. That's enough. He nodded, eyes glistening. It is. Later that afternoon, back in her chambers, Elena pinned Julian's drawing to the wall beside her desk, right next to her law degree. Not as evidence, as reminder. That evening, as golden light spilled through her windows, she opened her journal one last time and wrote, Justice isn't cold. It breathes. It bends. It holds space for broken people to become whole. Not because they deserve it, but because every child deserves a chance to be loved well. Today, I didn't rule. I witnessed. And sometimes, witnessing is the most powerful judgment of all. Outside, the city hummed with ordinary magic. And in a quiet classroom, a little boy raised his hand for the first time and knew deep in his bones that he was safe. Because somewhere, a woman who once had nothing had given him everything. Severity, but for clarity. Not for punishment, but for restoration. And though she never saw Julian in court again, his presence lingered, in the way she paused before sentencing a young father in the extra care she took with custody evaluations, in the quiet hope she allowed herself to feel when parents chose their child over their pride. Then came the invitation. It arrived on thick ivory paper, sealed with a simple wax stamp. No return address, just her name in elegant script. She opened it slowly, heart already knowing. You're cordially invited to Julian's 6th birthday party. Theme: Heroes Who Stay. Please come as yourself. Julian, with help from Mama and Dada, her breath caught. Heroes who stay. Not the ones who swoop in with grand gestures, but the ones who show up day after day, even when it's hard, even when they're tired, even when no one applauds. She almost didn't go. Not out of fear, but out of respect. She wasn't family. She was something else. A guardian of fairness. A witness to change. But Julian had always seen her as more. The day of the party, she stood outside a sunlit backyard in Brookline, dressed in soft linen, holding a gift wrapped in star-patterned paper. A children's book titled The Judge and the Tree, which she'd quietly commissioned from a local illustrator. The story was simple. A wise woman who sat beneath a great tree and helped lost animals find their way home. Not by fixing them, but by listening. She hesitated at the gate. Then Julian spotted her. Judge Ella. He tore across the lawn in a superhero cape, leaping into her arms before she could brace herself. You came. You're my hero. She laughed, holding him tight. I'm not a hero, sweetheart. Yes, you are, he insisted, pulling back to look at her. You stayed. Behind him, Alexander approached, taller now, softer around the edges, eyes warm with gratitude. Lila stood nearby, smiling, holding a tray of cupcakes shaped like gavels and books. You didn't have to come, Alexander said softly. I know, she replied. But he asked. Inside the house, the party buzzed with laughter and music. Children ran in capes, faces painted, shouting about justice and kindness. At one point, Julian climbed onto a small stool and announced, Today we honor the heroes who stay. He pointed to Lila. Mama stays when I'm scared. To Alexander. Dada stays even when he's busy. Then to Elena. And Judge Ella, she stayed when everyone else left. Tears welled in her eyes. She didn't speak. Just nodded. Later, as the sun dipped low, Alexander found her on the porch, watching fireflies blink in the dusk. He talks about you all the time, he said, leaning against the railing beside her. Says you taught him that fairness isn't about winning, it's about making sure everyone feels seen. She smiled faintly. He's wiser than most adults. He gets it from you, Alexander said quietly. Then, after a pause, I started a foundation last month. For kids in broken custody battles. We fund therapy, legal aid, parenting coaches. Called it the Marquez Initiative. She turned to him, stunned. Alexander, you can't. I can, he said gently. And I did. Because you showed me that real legacy isn't buildings or billions. It's healing. She looked away, throat tight. I didn't do it for recognition. I know, he said. That's why it's yours. They stood in silence as twilight deepened. Then, softly, do you ever regret it? All of it. She thought of the penthouse, the divorce, the nights eating rice alone, the courtroom where she'd faced him not as a wounded wife, but as a vessel of justice. No, she said finally, because if I hadn't walked through that fire, I wouldn't be here. And neither would you. He nodded, eyes glistening. Thank you for not letting me burn alone. Inside, Julian called out, Dada, Judge Ella, come see my cake. They turned toward the light, toward the laughter, toward the boy who'd become the bridge between their broken past and something tender, something whole. And as Elena stepped back inside, she realized she hadn't just given Julian a fair chance. He'd given her back her faith, in people, in second chances, in the quiet truth that love, when rooted in respect, doesn't vanish. The probate and family court, not for her connections, but for her unwavering balance between law and compassion. Her courtroom became a place where people didn't just fear judgment, they found clarity. And Julian, he was 10 now, tall for his age, thoughtful, with his father's sharp mind and his mother's gentle heart. He still sent her drawings every few months. Not of superheroes anymore, but of trees with deep roots, bridges over rivers, scales balanced by small hands. Then, on a quiet spring morning, a letter arrived, not in an envelope, but hand-delivered by a courier in a crisp uniform. Inside, a single sheet of paper embossed with the seal of Harvard Law School. Dear Judge Marquez, You are cordially invited to deliver the keynote address at our annual symposium on ethical jurisprudence. Theme: Justice Beyond the Gavel, when impartiality meets humanity. We believe your journey embodies this ideal. Dean Miriam Cole, her mentor. Now Dean. Still believing in her. She accepted. The day of the symposium, she stood backstage in a tailored suit, heart pounding not from nerves, but from memory. The auditorium was packed: judges, professors, students, journalists. And in the third row, 3 familiar faces: Lila, Alexander, and Julian, now in a blazer too big for him, sitting straight-backed, eyes bright with pride. She stepped to the podium. For a moment, silence. Then she spoke, not as a judge citing precedent, but as a woman who'd walked through fire and emerged not unscarred, but whole. 14 years ago, she began, voice clear and steady, I left a marriage with nothing but my name and a suitcase. I was told I'd never recover, that I'd be defined forever as the woman Alexander Thorne discarded. A murmur rippled through the room. Cameras clicked. But here's what they didn't understand, she continued. True justice isn't about winning. It's about refusing to let pain harden you into someone you don't recognize. It's about looking into the eyes of the person who hurt you and seeing not just their failure, but their potential to change. She glanced at Alexander. He met her gaze, jaw tight, tears glistening. I could have punished him, she said softly. I had the power, the platform, the public sympathy. But if I had, I would have taught his son that love is conditional, that mistakes erase worth. And that would have been the real injustice. She turned to Julian. Instead, I chose to hold space for growth. Not for him. For you, Julian. Because every child deserves parents who learn, stumble, and try again. Applause began, soft at first, then swelling like tide. But the greatest lesson I learned, she said, voice trembling now, wasn't about him. It was about me. I thought I needed to prove I was strong by never looking back. But strength isn't absence of feeling. It's choosing integrity even when your heart is breaking. It's showing up, even when you're afraid you'll fail. She paused, looked out at the sea of faces. Justice without humanity is just control wearing a robe. And humanity without boundaries is chaos dressed as kindness. The balance between them? That's where healing lives. When she finished, the room rose in a standing ovation. Afterward, in the hallway, Julian ran to her, eyes shining. You said my name. I did, she smiled. Because you're why it matters. Alexander approached slowly, holding 2 cups of tea, her favorite, chamomile with honey, just how she used to drink it years ago. You remembered, she said, surprised. I remember everything, he admitted. The way you took your coffee, the book you read before bed, the sound of your laugh when you thought no one was listening. She took the cup. Why? Because losing you taught me how to see, he said quietly. Not just look. See. And once you learn that, you can't unsee it. Lila joined them, placing a hand on Julian's shoulder. He wrote you a speech for this, she said, nodding to her son. 10 drafts. Said you deserved the truth, not just the facts. Julian grinned shyly. I called it The Lady Who Stayed. Elena's eyes filled. She knelt, pulled him close. You're going to change the world, you know that? Only if I stay kind, he whispered back. As they walked out into the sunlight, the 4 of them side by side, not a family by law, but by choice, they passed a courtyard where law students debated ethics under blooming cherry trees. And for the first time in her life, Elena felt no shadow behind her. Only light ahead. Because she hadn't just survived the past. She'd transformed it into a compass, for herself, for Julian, and for everyone who steadied beyond his years. She restored. And when he hugged her afterward, she whispered, You were my greatest case, and he replied, And you were my first hero. Now she lived in a small house near the Charles River, modest, sunlit, filled with books, plants, and the kind of silence that doesn't ache but breathes. She volunteered at a legal aid clinic twice a week, mentoring young public defenders, always reminding them. The law is a tool. But justice? That's a choice you make every morning. One evening in late autumn, as amber leaves spiraled past her window, she found a plain envelope tucked beneath her door. No stamp. No return address. Just her name, written in a hand she'd know anywhere, Alexander's, though slightly shakier now, aged by time. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Elena, Julian leaves for Oxford next week. He's been accepted to study philosophy and ethics. Says he wants to build systems that heal, not punish. He asked me to give you this before he goes. Beneath the note lay a small, wrapped parcel tied with twine. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a leather-bound journal, thick, worn at the edges, filled with Julian's handwriting. On the first page, in bold ink, "For Judge Ella, you taught me that fairness isn't about being right. It's about making space for people to become better. I'm writing this so your story never gets lost. Because the world needs to know, sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is show up, with grace, with boundaries, and with an open heart." Julian tears blurred her vision. She turned the pages, essays, reflections, letters he'd never sent. One passage stood out. She could have ruined him. Everyone expected her to. But she chose something harder. She held him accountable, and still believed he could change. That's the kind of justice that changes generations. A knock at the door startled her. She wiped her eyes, opened it. Julian stood there, suitcase at his feet, wearing a peacoat and that familiar half-smile. Behind him, Alexander and Lila waited by the car, giving them space. "I couldn't leave without saying goodbye," he said softly. She pulled him into a hug, breathing in the scent of rain and youth and promise. "You'll change the world, Julian." He pulled back, eyes glistening. "Only because you showed me how." They sat on her porch swing as dusk painted the sky in violet and gold. He told her about his fears, of failing, of forgetting what really matters in the halls of power. She listened, then said, "Remember this, integrity isn't what you do when everyone's watching. It's what you do when no one is. And you've already proven you know the difference." He nodded, then reached into his coat and handed her a small box. Inside was a silver pendant, a gavel entwined with an olive branch. "My design," he said. "For you. So you never forget, you were the bridge." She fastened it around her neck. The metal was warm against her skin. As he stood to leave, he paused. "Will you write to me?" "Every month," she promised. "No expectations. Just truth." He smiled. "That's all I've ever wanted from you." Later, after the car disappeared down the street, Elena stood alone on the porch, wind tugging at her hair. The city hummed below, indifferent to the quiet revolutions that shape lives. She walked inside, placed Julian's journal on her desk beside her old robe, and lit a single candle, the same one she'd lit the night Alexander came to her in the snow. Outside, the first stars blinked awake. And in the silence, she finally understood. She hadn't just survived the past. She'd woven it into something beautiful. Not through revenge, not through erasure, but through the radical, relentless act of choosing humanity, over and over, even when it hurt. She closed her eyes, touched the pendant at her throat, and whispered into the dark, "Thank you, Julian, for letting me be part of your story." And somewhere across the ocean, a young man unpacked his suitcase in a dorm room in Oxford, pinned a childhood drawing to his wall, 3 figures under a sun, and wrote in his own journal, "Heroes don't wear capes. They wear robes, or sweaters, or nothing special at all. They just stay. And that changes everything." In her quiet house, Elena smiled. The gavel had long since